Yesterday evening, Mark Carney stood in front of a CNN camera at 7:47 p.m. Eastern Time and delivered the most consequential geopolitical execution in a generation. This was not a routine diplomatic leak. It was not a choreographed statement from a G7 sideline or a wisp compromise over a state dinner. It was a 37-minute live prosecution of a sitting United States president broadcast directly into American living rooms. For decades, the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States has operated under an unspoken rulebook of quiet diplomacy, closed-door negotiations, and carefully managed public harmony. Yesterday, that rulebook was torn to shreds in plain view of millions of viewers. Carney did not request a formal White House audience, nor did he use the standard State Department channels. He bypassed the entire Washington political architecture to speak directly to the American public, acting simultaneously as prosecutor, witness, and judge. This is not a standard trade dispute or a temporary friction between neighbours. This is a deliberate, highly calculated sovereign intervention designed to reshape the power balance of North American trade. To understand why Ottawa authorised a manoeuvre of this magnitude, one must look at the structural pressures building against Canadian sovereignty. For months, international media narratives have framed the current trade tensions through a single, repetitive lens: absolute American dominance face-to-face with a weaker northern neighbour. The prevailing view in Washington assumed that Canada would simply react defensively to tariff threats, eventually capitulating to preserve its access to the world's largest consumer market. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, Canada sends approximately 75% of its total exports south of the border, creating a deep asymmetric vulnerability that US administrations routinely exploit. However, absolute vulnerability also creates a tipping point where traditional diplomacy yields diminishing returns. When a sovereign nation faces an existential threat to its economic foundation, the risk profile changes. Carney's media strike demonstrates that Ottawa no longer views standard diplomatic protocol as a viable shield against unilateral American protectionism. Here is the timeline to keep things clear, revealing how this sequenced political and diplomatic operation built toward yesterday's explosion. The foundation was laid years ago when both nations signed the USMCA, a treaty meant to guarantee stable, duty-free access across North America and serve as the cornerstone of continental supply chains. That agreement specifically locked in zero tariff structures for critical sectors, including automotive production, where 94% of Canadian assembly output relies on unrestricted access to US buyers. The current crisis accelerated when the White House unilaterally ignored those binding commitments, imposing sweeping penalties under the guise of national security exemptions. Canada pursued the established legal route, resulting in a unanimous international arbitration ruling that declared the US tariffs a direct violation of the signed treaty. Washington simply ignored the verdict. Yesterday's 37-minute broadcast was the direct culmination of that defiance, a synchronized counteroffensive executed precisely when Washington believed Canada had no options left. That official arbitration victory is the legal justification. But here is the other half, the strategic architecture that most mainstream coverage has entirely missed. Carney's address was not a random outburst of frustration. It was a surgical strike designed around 6 declarative sentences that systematically dismantled the American narrative. He stated clearly that Canada did not initiate this conflict, did not violate the agreements, did not threaten continental unity, did not destabilize regional alliances, and did not walk away from the negotiating table. Then the structural hammer dropped. By matching each declaration against specific, documented actions taken by the current US administration, Carney flipped the script of aggression. In less than 60 seconds, the narrative shifted from a dominant superpower disciplining a dependent neighbour to a rogue state breaking its own laws against a loyal ally. The delivery was clinical, devoid of emotional gestures or theatrical pauses. Transforming what could have been a defensive complaint into an unyielding legal verdict, the strategic depth of this move became undeniable when Carney introduced the single most dangerous word in diplomacy: enemy. He stated flatly that Canada is now forced to respond to a partner that has chosen to treat it not as a competitor, not as a rival, but as an enemy. This is a profound rhetorical escalation. By using that specific term, Ottawa is explicitly signaling that it no longer classifies the relationship as a manageable commercial disagreement. We are no longer talking about localized trade disputes, tariff schedules, or historical grievances over softwood lumber. We are talking about the complete breakdown of a continental alliance. When a head of government defines an asymmetric relationship in terms of enmity on global television, it tells the international community that the underlying trust required to enforce contracts, defend shared airspace through NORAD, and maintain open borders has evaporated. To anchor this claim in undeniable reality, Carney reached for a physical prop, the exact text of the USMCA treaty signed by Donald Trump. This was a brilliant tactical maneuver. By holding up the actual document, Carney converted an abstract legal debate into a highly visual, irrefutable piece of evidence for ordinary viewers. He walked the audience through the specific clauses that prohibit unilateral tariffs under these conditions, demonstrating that there are no grey areas, no fine print, and no secret exemptions hidden within the text. He paired this textual reading with the unanimous international judgment, confirming the American violation. The implication was devastating. On live television, a foreign leader proved to millions of Americans that their own executive branch signed a comprehensive deal, flagrantly violated its terms, and then dismissed the lawful ruling when caught. This is not mere political criticism. It is the public exposure of a systemic breach of contract. The psychological warfare deepened when Carney shifted his focus away from the political class and looked directly into the camera lens to address the American electorate. He stated that the American people deserve to hear the truth, immediately preceding the release of an audio recording from a high-level bilateral phone call. The White House cannot dismiss this recording as a product of espionage or a rogue intelligence operation. It was captured under standard, mutually understood procedures for executive communications. The audio captured the US president dismissing Canadian sovereignty as nonsense, mocking joint defence commitments to NORAD, and explicitly threatening to crush Canada's economy until it became an economic wasteland. This is raw, unvarnished coercive pressure, stripped of diplomatic euphemism. The exposure of these words instantly neutralizes the White House's ability to frame its trade policy as fair or reciprocal bargaining. The White House immediate response reveals just how effectively the trap was sprung. Rather than issuing a flat denial or claiming the audio was a sophisticated artificial intelligence fabrication, the administration fell back on the standard defense that the remarks were taken out of context. In crisis communication, however, transitioning from "this did not happen" to "you misinterpreting the context" is an admission of reality. There is no strategic context that makes a hidden promise to economically liquidate a sovereign ally acceptable to an international audience. By validating the authenticity of the tape, the administration confirmed the exact narrative Carney established on CNN. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as this situation unfolds, because the domestic political fallout from this admission is already spreading through Allied capitals. Leaving the West Wing entirely on the defensive, Carney then converted this narrative dominance into immediate material leverage by confirming a hard deadline, March 18th. With exactly 8 days remaining on the clock, Canada has introduced a tangible element of risk that escapes the realm of television rhetoric and enters the daily lives of citizens. He calmly outlined a multi-layered escalation strategy: the complete suspension of energy exports, the freezing of key trade agreements, the scaling back of continental defence cooperation, and targeted disruptions to cross-border financial systems. Significantly, Carney did not hide the economic costs from the American consumer. He acknowledged that gas prices would surge and household utility bills would rise, but he paired this warning with a precise political wedge, stating directly to the viewers that this economic pain is not your fault. This is a masterclass in political isolation. By separating the American public from the decisions of their executive leader, Carney is attempting to build an external wall of domestic political pressure around the White House. He openly declared his belief that the majority of Americans, once presented with the treaty text and the recorded audio, would side with Canada's position over that of their own president. This is an extraordinarily bold calculation designed to exploit existing domestic political divisions within the United States. Carney is gambling that the American electorate's skepticism of executive overreach will outweigh traditional nationalist alignment. The invitation for a live, unscripted debate wrapped the entire strategy in an inescapable dilemma. Accept the debate and face a meticulously prepared prosecutor on live television, or refuse and appear to be retreating from a challenge of courage. The initial social media response from the president, filled with personal insults and a flat refusal to debate, suggests that Washington has no coherent counter-strategy. The battlefield has fundamentally shifted, and the traditional mechanisms of continental diplomacy are no longer functioning. Canada has abandoned the position of a passive observer waiting for the next round of punitive tariffs, opting instead to leverage its critical position in energy and supply chains to force an immediate crisis. This is a high-stakes gamble that hinges entirely on whether public exposure can compel a superpower to honour its legal obligations. The clock is ticking toward March 18th, and the economic integration of North America hangs in the balance. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. That unanswered question brings us directly to the hidden mechanics of the document Mark Carney held up to the camera, the actual legal and economic scaffolding that Ottawa is now using as a lever to disrupt the Washington consensus. To truly understand why Canada has taken a risk of this magnitude, we have to look past the political theatre of the CNN broadcast and dissect the granular architecture of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement itself. This is not just a collection of trade guidelines. It is a rigid, multi-layered treaty designed to lock in specific corporate and state behaviours across 3 borders. When the White House chose to violate those terms, it didn't just create a diplomatic dispute. It threatened the structural baseline of a $2.6 trillion integrated market. What Carney exposed on live television was a systematic operation by the US executive branch to selectively enforce trade rules, and Canada's counter-offensive is built on a precise, 3-pronged exploitation of the treaty's own text. To break down exactly how this legal trap is structured, we must look at the 3 specific pillars Carney highlighted during his seminar-style address. First, let us examine the text of Chapter 10 of the USMCA, which governs administrative and dispute settlement procedures. This is the exact mechanism designed to prevent the precise scenario currently unfolding: a large superpower using unilateral tariffs to bully a smaller trading partner. Under the terms of Chapter 10, when a dispute arises over tariff application or trade barriers, an independent binational panel must be formed to issue a legally binding ruling. In this specific case, Canada triggered a Chapter 10 panel over the sudden imposition of American levies on advanced manufacturing materials. The key players here were not just cabinet ministers, but a panel of international trade lawyers who spent months reviewing the textual commitments of both nations. The result was not a divided partisan opinion. It was a unanimous 5-0 international judgment declaring that the United States had flagrantly violated its treaty obligations. Under the terms of the deal, the US was required to immediately remove the tariffs or face proportional retaliatory measures. By ignoring this verdict, the White House effectively signalized that it no longer recognizes the judicial authority of the very treaty it authored. Second, the structural architecture of the dispute hinges on the rules of origin for automotive and advanced industrial manufacturing, located primarily within Chapter 4 of the agreement. This is where the financial terms become staggeringly concrete. The USMCA mandates that for a vehicle to be traded duty-free across North America, 75% of its components must be manufactured within the 3 member nations, a significant increase from the 62.5% required under the original NAFTA framework. Over the last several years, Canadian parts manufacturers and assembly plants have restructured their entire capital deployment to meet this 75% threshold, ensuring that 94% of Canadian automotive production goes directly to US buyers duty-free. By unilaterally introducing tariffs outside this framework, the White House did not just tax Canadian goods, it effectively dismantled the supply chain predictability that trillions of dollars of private capital rely upon. Carney's strategy relies on exposing this exact economic friction to American corporate interests. demonstrating that Washington's protectionism is actively breaking the supply chains of its own domestic manufacturer. Third, we must look at the specific energy integration clauses that Ottawa is now weaponizing as its primary counter-leverage ahead of the March 18th deadline. While the original NAFTA included a controversial proportionality clause that legally prevented Canada from cutting off energy supplies to the United States, the renegotiated USMCA stripped that provision away, restoring full sovereign control over Canada's natural resource exports. This brings us to the strategic terms of the current standoff. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, exporting over 4.3 million barrels per day, which accounts for more than 20% of the total US refinery intake. Furthermore, the cross-border electricity grid and natural gas pipelines create a profound structural dependency across the American Midwest and Northeast. By establishing a hard 8-day clock, Carney is threatening to invoke emergency sovereign powers to restrict these flows, targeting the exact energy corridors that fuel American industrial centres. This technical breakdown reveals that Canada is not pleading for a return to fair play. It is utilising the exact legal architecture of the USMCA to execute a structured containment strategy. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we continue to track how these specific treaty clauses are being converted into geopolitical weapons. The official narrative from the White House continues to treat this as a simple dispute over border taxes. But the granular reality shows that Canada has laid a comprehensive trap. By securing a unanimous legal verdict under Chapter 10, Ottawa has established an ironclad legal justification before the global community. If the United States continues to reject the panel's authority while simultaneously demanding that other global actors adhere to international rules, its credibility as a reliable treaty partner collapses entirely. The financial terms of this confrontation extend far beyond the immediate tariff percentages. We are looking at a calculated disruption to a bilateral trade dynamic that moves nearly $2 billion worth of goods and services across the border every single day. The specific sectors Canada is threatening to lock down represent the high-margin, irreplaceable inputs of the American industrial engine. If the cross-border flow of automotive parts is halted for even 72 hours, assembly lines in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana will stall due to the just-in-time logistics model that governs modern manufacturing. Carney understands this vulnerability perfectly. His 37-minute presentation was a direct signal to the American business community that their own government's treaty violations are about to manifest as a material shock to corporate balance sheets, consumer prices, and domestic employment. This is where the strategic logic of the sequencing becomes unmistakable. Ottawa did not rush to escalate the moment the unilateral tariffs were introduced. Instead, Canadian strategists allowed the official dispute mechanism to run its course over several months, carefully documenting every American violation and securing a definitive legal judgment. This deliberate delay was designed to exhaust every traditional diplomatic avenue, ensuring that when Canada finally launched its counterstrike, it could do so from a position of absolute legal rectitude. Yesterday's televised intervention was the pivot point where legal victory was converted into public political pressure. By walking the American audience through the precise language of the USMCA, Carney successfully demonstrated that the current administration is actively undermining its own signature economic legacy. What this means for the broader geopolitical landscape is a complete realignment of North American economic security. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that Canada's economic dependence created a permanent geopolitical compliance. By leveraging the rules of origin, the energy integration realities, and the binding dispute panel verdicts, Ottawa is proving that isometric dependence can be inverted if a smaller nation has the courage to enforce the letter of the law. This is a highly sequenced political and diplomatic operation, executed with clinical precision by an insider who knows exactly which economic levers will cause the maximum structural friction inside the American system. The immediate task for the White House is no longer just defending its protectionist trade policies. It must now find a way to de-escalate a crisis that threatens the structural stability of the entire continental market. Every major corporate boardroom from Detroit to New York is currently calculating the cost of a full Canadian energy and supply chain shutdown on March 18th. The financial terms have been set, the legal violations have been laid bare, and the mechanism for retaliation is locked into place. The strategic architecture of the USMCA, originally designed to bind three nations into a cooperative economic bloc, has been successfully transformed into a sovereign cage for the administration that broke it. But as the clock ticks closer to the 8-day deadline, an even more volatile element of this trap is beginning to materialise. Ultimately, yesterday's unprecedented televised escalation laid bare the vulnerability of America's executive trade policy, while exposing the raw corporate and energy leverage Canada has integrated into its treaty architecture. By combining an unyielding legal verdict with a calculated domestic media campaign, Ottawa has successfully shifted the battlefield from defensive diplomacy to an offensive containment operation. This dramatic shift marks the definitive end of the post-Cold War bilateral consensus and introduces an entirely new playbook for Canada-US relations. For over half a century, Canadian foreign policy operated under the assumption of permanent continental alignment, relying on the quiet diplomacy of the pre-Trump era, where trade disputes were managed via technocratic back channels and minor regulatory adjustments. Yesterday's broadcast officially terminated that era. By categorising the relationship through the lens of strategic enmity on live television, Ottawa has signalled that it will no longer sacrifice its domestic sovereignty to maintain the illusion of an unassailable partnership. This is not a temporary spat, this is a structural fracture. The bilateral relationship has been permanently re-indexed as a zero-sum calculation, forcing both nations to treat cross-border infrastructure not as a shared utility, but as geopolitical high ground, beyond the immediate borders of North America. This confrontation sends a profound shockwave through global alliances and provides a blueprint for middle powers navigating an increasingly transactional international order. For years, hegemons have operated under the assumption that deep economic integration guaranteed political compliance from smaller partners. Carney's willingness to weaponize the USMCA text proves the exact opposite. Deep integration creates reciprocal, systemic vulnerabilities that a highly disciplined middle power can exploit. From Brussels to Tokyo, Allied capitals are watching this surgical counter-offensive with intense scrutiny. If Canada succeeds in leveraging its energy and industrial corridors to force a White House de-escalation, it will fundamentally validate the concept of strategic autonomy for secondary powers worldwide. The message to Washington is unmistakable. The monetization of historic alliances carries a severe, localized cost that can be extracted directly from the hegemon's domestic economy. The material consequences will manifest most acutely across the integrated sectors of energy, trade, and continental defense. In the energy sector, Canada's threat to selectively choke crude and electricity flows breaks the long-standing assumption of absolute American energy security, forcing US industrial hubs to reckon with the immediate vulnerability of their supply lines. In trade, the calculated targeting of just-in-time automotive networks will force multinational corporations to reshore or diversify capital away from volatile border corridors, permanently raising the risk premium of North American operations. Most critically, the public exposure of the White House, mocking its NORAD commitments, introduces a dangerous instability into continental defense. When the structural trust required to manage shared early warning systems and aerospace sovereignty is openly brought into question, the defensive perimeter of the entire continent is compromised. This strategic realignment stands in stark contrast to the historical norms of the late 20th century. In the pre-Trump era, Canadian prime ministers prioritized institutional stability above all else, frequently absorbing minor economic asymmetric disadvantages to protect the overarching security umbrella of the United States. Today, Ottawa has abandoned that deference. The current Canadian leadership is operating on a clinical assessment of hard power, recognizing that the rules-based international order has been replaced by a raw transactional landscape. Rather than waiting to be marginalized by unilateral executive decrees, Canada is actively deploying its structural advantages, its status as an energy superpower, its dominant position in critical mineral networks, and its legal rectitude under international treaties to establish an aggressive deterrence framework. The immediate next step will not be decided in a diplomatic summit or through standard bureaucratic consultations. The strategic clock is now ticking directly toward the hard March 18th deadline, creating an intense, compounding pressure within the American corporate and political systems. As multinational manufacturing firms calculate the hourly cost of a full supply chain freeze and energy grids prepare for unprecedented cross-border restrictions, the White House is facing an unmanageable domestic political crisis. The administration must now choose between executing a highly public policy reversal that validates Canada's legal authority, or accelerating a volatile economic conflict that will immediately